Welcome to the channel. Today we've got something incredible for you. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. In the stillness of the night, a faint sound echoed from the attic. A soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the wind, nor the house settling. It was something else. Something waiting, hidden in the shadows. As the clock struck midnight, the footsteps grew louder, echoing in the silence, beckoning her closer. What secrets lay buried in the attic? And why did the house seem to be holding its breath, waiting for someone to uncover the truth? Stay with us. The mystery is just beginning. Chapter 1. A midnight call. The night in London was unusually quiet, the fog creeping through the streets like a blanket, muffling the sounds of the bustling city. The lamplights flickered dimly along the cobbled roads, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the very heart of darkness. Inside the comfortable study of 221B Baker Street, however, the only sound that could be heard was the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth and the quiet rustling of a newspaper in Dr. Watson's hands. Sherlock Holmes, ever the enigmatic figure, sat in his usual chair, his sharp eyes scanning over a series of maps and documents that he had laid out on the table before him. His mind, though still as sharp as ever, was momentarily lost in thought, his attention focused on the fine details of an old case that had been gnawing at him. But the peace of the room, serene and almost tranquil, was abruptly shattered by a sudden ring of the doorbell. Startled, Watson lowered his newspaper and looked toward the door. Holmes, however, seemed unfazed, as if he had been expecting this interruption all along. He didn't rise from his chair, but instead, his eyes gleamed with curiosity. Watson, ever the more practical of the two, stood and moved toward the door. The ringing bell echoed again, its sharp sound cutting through the otherwise peaceful evening. As Watson opened the door, he was greeted by a figure draped in a heavy cloak, the silhouette of the woman almost swallowed by the fog that clung to her. She was tall, with an air of grace despite the evident distress that weighed on her. Her face, pale and tired, looked out from beneath a dark veil, eyes wide with an unspoken fear. "Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice trembling but steady. "I've come to ask for your help." Holmes looked up from his papers with a calm and deliberate gaze, as though he had known the visitor would arrive at this very moment. He motioned for her to enter. "Please, madam, come in," he said smoothly. "Watson, would you be so kind as to fetch some tea for our guest?" Watson, always ready to attend to the more mundane tasks, nodded and made his way to the kitchen, leaving Holmes and the mysterious woman alone in the drawing room. The woman took a seat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and though she tried to hide it, her nervousness was palpable. Holmes did not press her for details immediately. Instead, he waited, his eyes never leaving her face, waiting for her to speak. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her words coming out in a hushed, trembling whisper. "I need your help, Mr. Holmes," she repeated. It's my house. I've been hearing footsteps, soft, deliberate footsteps, in my attic at night." Holmes leaned forward slightly, intrigued but maintaining his characteristic composure. "Footsteps, you say?" "Yes," she replied, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I know the house is empty. No one lives there. I live alone. But every night for the past week, I hear them. The footsteps begin at midnight, and they move slowly across the attic, like someone is pacing back and forth." The calm, measured voice of Holmes contrasted with the tension in the air. "And have you investigated this noise? Is it possible it could be an animal, or perhaps the house settling?" "No," she exclaimed, her hands trembling as she clutched her cloak tighter around her. "I have checked every inch of that attic. I have no servants, no staff. I even locked the door to the attic last night, and yet the steps continued." Holmes did not appear shocked by the woman's urgency, but he did seem thoroughly intrigued. He steepled his fingers in thought, his mind already working at full speed, sifting through possibilities. There was something about her demeanor that suggested she wasn't just a woman who had become paranoid. There was a truth here, veiled beneath the mystery. "I see," Holmes said softly, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the details of her story. "Tell me, madam, have you experienced anything unusual before this event? Any strange occurrences in the house or in your life recently?" Her eyes flickered with hesitation. I don't think so, but my late husband was a historian. He spent years studying ancient artifacts and forgotten histories. He was always obsessed with uncovering lost secrets. It's as though something in that house is calling to me. The mention of her late husband piqued Holmes's interest even further. He could tell that this case was not as simple as it appeared. There was something deeper at play here, something hidden in the shadows of the attic and perhaps buried in the history of the house itself. Holmes stood up, his figure tall and imposing against the firelight. He turned to Watson, who had just returned with the tea. Holmes gave a subtle nod, indicating that this was no ordinary case. "I shall accompany you to your home tomorrow night," Holmes declared. "We will observe this phenomenon ourselves. But I must warn you, Mrs. Carver, it's possible that what you are experiencing may not be so easily explained away. The truth may be more complicated than you suspect." She nodded in gratitude, but there was an underlying fear in her expression. Holmes could see that she was not merely seeking help. She was looking for answers to a mystery that had haunted her, perhaps for longer than she realized. As the conversation wound down and the woman left, Watson couldn't help but ask, "What do you think, Holmes? Do you believe it's a ghost?" Holmes looked toward the door, his expression unreadable, but his voice was calm. "It is too soon to say, Watson. But one thing is clear. This case is far more than it appears. There are footsteps in the attic, and I suspect they belong to something far more sinister than a mere haunting." As the door closed behind their visitor and the night returned to its peaceful stillness, Holmes remained deep in thought, his mind already preparing for the mystery that awaited them in the house at the edge of London. The game was afoot, and it promised to be one of his most intriguing cases yet. Chapter 2. The Empty House. The morning light was soft and hazy, the kind of light that made the streets of London seem almost otherworldly. Holmes and Watson had arrived early, the fog still clinging to the narrow alleys, wrapping itself like a blanket around the old buildings. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and moss from the surrounding trees. As they approached the house, Watson noticed how quiet it seemed, far removed from the bustling streets they had left behind. The house stood at the top of a hill, tall and imposing, its silhouette sharp against the misty backdrop. A grand old structure, built in the Victorian era, with high windows that gazed out over the city like watchful eyes. The ivy crept up its stone walls, and the weathered roof suggested that the house had been standing for far longer than its current occupants had lived in it. Mrs. Eleanor Carver opened the door to them as they arrived, her face pale from lack of sleep, but her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. She greeted them with a quiet smile, though her anxiety was still evident. She led them inside, and immediately the atmosphere of the house felt different, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Holmes entered the house with his usual calm, but his sharp eyes scanned every detail as they crossed the threshold. Watson followed, glancing around as they moved through the hall, which was adorned with old portraits and dark wood furniture. The house was beautiful, but there was a sense of neglect, as if time had taken its toll, and no one had bothered to restore what had once been a proud and welcoming home. "Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Carver said quietly as she led them toward the stairs, The attic is this way. Holmes nodded, his mind already processing the situation, though his expression remained neutral. Watson, on the other hand, felt a growing sense of unease, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The house seemed too still, too quiet, far too quiet for a home that was supposed to be lived in. They climbed the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath their feet. The air grew cooler as they ascended, and Watson noticed the temperature shift, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. At the top of the stairs was a narrow hallway, dimly lit by the faint glow of a single lantern. Mrs. Carver led them to the door at the far end, where the attic was located. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She produced a key from her pocket, turning it in the lock with a hesitant motion, as if she feared what might be on the other side. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit attic filled with old furniture, trunks and piles of forgotten belongings. Dust swirled in the air, dancing in the beams of light that filtered through the small, high window. Holmes stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the far corner, where a large wooden chest sat, partially open. The rest of the attic appeared untouched, the only evidence of activity being the faint imprint of footprints in the dust leading toward the chest. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, moving carefully across the floor, his footsteps barely making a sound. He knelt by the chest, running his fingers lightly along the edge of the lid. The wood was old, the hinges worn, but it was clear this chest had been disturbed recently. It was unlike any ordinary chest. There was a sense of purpose to its positioning, as if it had been placed there for a reason. "Watson, observe this," Holmes said softly, pointing to the dust patterns on the floor. "The disturbance here is recent. Someone, or something, has been in this space. The footsteps that Mrs. Carver hears may not be a figment of her imagination after all." Watson nodded, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had been building inside him. The house seemed to breathe, the very air in it thick with an unspoken tension. As he glanced around the attic, he noticed the shadows that seemed to flicker just beyond the corners of his vision. A strange, almost imperceptible noise echoed faintly, like the soft tap of footsteps on the stairs. Holmes stood up, his eyes narrowing with focused intensity as he surveyed the room. He moved toward the chest, carefully lifting the lid. Inside there were no hidden treasures or ghosts, only a collection of old papers, letters, and forgotten artifacts. The musty smell of old parchment filled the air as Holmes carefully sifted through the papers. One particular letter caught his eye. It was sealed with a faded wax emblem, the kind that suggested age and significance. Holmes gently broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his fingers moving with careful precision. The handwriting was elegant, yet faint, as though it had been written long ago and carefully preserved. "This," Holmes muttered, more to himself than to Watson, "is most curious." The letter was written in a poetic, cryptic style, its contents alluding to something far greater than the mundane. It was a message from Eleanor Carver's late husband, written shortly before his death. The letter spoke of secrets hidden within the house, of ancient truths that were being kept buried, and of something or someone who would one day return to reveal those secrets. It was clear that Mrs. Carver's husband had been involved in something far more mysterious than mere historical research. Mrs. Carver, who had been standing in the doorway, looked over Holmes's shoulder, her face pale as she saw the letter. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "What does it mean?" Holmes stood silently for a moment, his mind racing. He glanced at Watson, who was still looking around the room uneasily. The air seemed to grow thicker with each passing second. "It means," Holmes said finally,
his voice low and calm, "that the footsteps you've been hearing are
not the workings of a ghost, but the echo of a hidden past, one that your late husband was uncovering. Your house is not merely a home, Mrs. Carver. It is a repository of secrets." There was a long pause, during which the only sound was the faint, eerie echo of footsteps once again, a soft, deliberate sound from somewhere deep within the house. Holmes stood still for a moment, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. Watson's eyes widened, and he looked toward Holmes, a sense of realization dawning on him. "We are not alone in this house, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "And I suspect we are about to uncover something far more sinister than we ever imagined." The footsteps seemed to draw nearer, and for the first time since their arrival, Holmes allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The mystery was deepening, and the game was only just beginning. Chapter 3. The Mysterious Sound. The evening had settled into an eerie stillness. The fog, thick and oppressive, clung to the streets of London, muffling even the usual hum of the city. At 221 B Baker Street, the atmosphere inside was nothing like the damp coldness outside. The warmth from the fire created a comforting cocoon, but there was something in the air that suggested tension, a quiet anticipation, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Holmes sat in his favorite armchair, his mind already swirling with the events of the night before. The letter, the cryptic message about hidden truths, the strange footsteps in the attic. All of it was beginning to form a web in his mind. Watson, seated across from him, carefully sipped his tea, watching his friend with growing curiosity. "Holmes," Watson began, breaking the silence. "What do you make of this? Mrs. Carver's story seems so unusual. Ghostly footsteps in an empty attic." Holmes's sharp gaze flicked toward Watson, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Watson, in my experience, the most unusual stories often have the most straightforward explanations, though they can be concealed behind layers of mystery. Our task is to peel back those layers, bit by bit, until the truth is exposed." Watson was about to respond when there was a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Carver had arrived, her face still pale from sleepless nights, but there was a certain resolve in her steps as she entered the room. "I've come to ask you to accompany me tonight, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low but filled with urgency. "It happens at midnight. The footsteps, they grow louder. They move across the attic as if someone is pacing back and forth just above my head. I need to know what it is. I can't stand it any longer." Holmes regarded her with his usual calm, then glanced at Watson, who nodded in silent agreement. "Very well, Mrs. Carver," Holmes said, rising from his chair. "We shall accompany you tonight, and we will observe the events firsthand." As night fell over London, the three of them made their way back to the house. The streets were deserted, the fog thickening as they approached the hill where Mrs. Carver's house stood. The old house loomed in the distance, its dark windows like eyes that stared down at them. Holmes and Watson exchanged a brief glance. The air was thick with something other than the usual quiet of London's nights. Inside, Mrs. Carver led them through the familiar, dimly lit corridors, and once again they ascended the narrow staircase to the attic. The same cool, musty air greeted them as they entered the space. This time, the room felt colder, as though the house itself knew they were about to uncover something it had long kept hidden. Holmes moved to the center of the room, his keen eyes scanning the surroundings. He noticed the dust, undisturbed except for the marks left by the previous night's investigation. There was a faint smell in the air, a mixture of old wood and the musty scent of forgotten belongings. The chest in the far corner seemed untouched, though its presence weighed heavily in the room, as if it were a sentinel guarding secrets that had been long buried. As midnight approached, Holmes gestured for Watson and Mrs. Carver to sit quietly, their presence as unobtrusive as possible. The atmosphere in the attic was thick with expectation. Mrs. Carver's eyes were wide with anxiety, and Holmes's sharp mind worked relentlessly, piecing together the puzzle. "Remain silent," Holmes whispered. "The answer may lie in the subtle." They sat in the darkness, the only light coming from the flickering lantern in the corner. The clock in the hall struck 12, and for a moment there was nothing, just the silent weight of the night. But then, as if in answer to an unspoken question, the faintest sound began to pierce the stillness. A soft creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth above them. The sound was faint at first, like a whisper in the night, but it quickly grew louder. Each step was measured, rhythmic, echoing in the stillness of the attic. Holmes's eyes narrowed, his face impassive, but his mind was racing, already processing the data, the possibilities. "Did you hear that?" Watson whispered, his voice filled with wonder and a tinge of fear. "There is someone up there." Holmes's expression remained calm. "It is the footsteps we've been expecting, Watson. But listen carefully. The rhythm is deliberate. It is not the random sound of an animal or the wind. This is purposeful. Someone or something is moving across the attic." Mrs. Carver's face grew even paler, her breath shallow. "But who?" Holmes raised a hand, signaling for silence. He stood slowly, his gaze fixed on the ceiling above them, his senses straining to catch every detail. The footsteps were growing louder now, their pace increasing, as though the figure above was moving with greater urgency. Watson shifted uneasily. "It's as though someone is pacing, waiting for something." Holmes nodded, his lips curling into a small smile of understanding. "Exactly, Watson. It is not the wandering steps of a lost soul. No, these steps have a purpose." Suddenly the sound stopped. Silence enveloped the room, thick and unsettling. The absence of sound was deafening. Mrs. Carver's breath caught in her throat, and Watson looked at Holmes, confusion and apprehension filling his gaze. Holmes didn't move for a moment. His mind was racing, analyzing the sound, the silence that had followed. He turned slowly to Mrs. Carver. "It's gone quiet," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What now?" Holmes looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of assurance and mystery. "We are not dealing with a haunting, Mrs. Carver. What we are hearing is a signal." "The footsteps were never meant to harm you. They are a call, a message. The question now is, who or what is leaving it?" Before Watson could respond, a soft sound echoed from the corner of the room, the creak of the chest, as if it too had been disturbed. Holmes's eyes snapped to it, his fingers already moving toward his pocket for the small silver pocket watch. Time, as always, was an essential piece of the puzzle. But before he could investigate further, the soft footsteps began again, this time louder, more insistent, and as if in answer to a deeper mystery. The air in the room seemed to pulse with each step, the sound of the footsteps resonating not just in the floorboards, but in the very walls around them. Holmes stood still, eyes sharp, scanning the attic. "I believe we are about to find the truth," he whispered, more to himself than to Watson. And as the steps continued their rhythmic pattern, the mystery grew deeper, each echo, each step, drawing them closer to the hidden secrets of the house and to the truth that had been locked away for so long. Chapter 4. A Hidden History. The night stretched on, and the house at the top of the hill seemed to grow more and more enveloped by the fog that crept in through every crack and corner. Inside, the attic felt colder than before. The quiet reverberated through the space, leaving only the rhythmic sound of the distant clock ticking in the hallway. Holmes and Watson stood, their presence unnoticed by the stillness that had settled over Mrs. Carver's home. The only disturbance was the soft shuffle of footsteps that had grown louder but had now ceased entirely. Holmes's gaze never wavered from the room. His mind was turning with calculations and deductions. The faint sound of the chest creaking earlier had caught his attention. He had already come to the conclusion that there was more to this house than the mere apparitions of restless spirits or echoes of the past. The house itself, with its thick walls and shadowed corners, was a repository of forgotten secrets, and the footsteps, those soft, deliberate steps, were guiding them toward the key. Turning slowly, Holmes approached the chest again. Its dark wood gleamed faintly in the flickering light of the lantern. The lid, still ajar, seemed to beckon him. Watson, standing slightly behind, watched as his friend moved with methodical care, his every movement measured, deliberate. Holmes's fingers brushed over the edge of the chest, and then, with a decisive motion, he opened it fully. Inside, the chest revealed its contents, a mix of ancient artifacts, yellowed papers, and forgotten relics, all piled together haphazardly. There was no sign of any treasure, no glint of gold or precious jewels. Instead, it was a trove of old letters, bound documents, and faded maps. It was a collection that spoke of a time long past, of a history buried beneath the layers of dust and time. Holmes's eyes flicked over the contents quickly, each item igniting a spark of recognition. He reached for the topmost letter, its edges frayed with age. He broke the seal carefully, his movements gentle, as if handling something fragile. The letter inside was written in elegant script, the ink faded but still legible. As Holmes read the first few lines, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's from her late husband," he murmured, "written in a style I recognize from ancient scholars." Watson moved closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder to catch the words on the page. "The time has come, and the past has resurfaced. The footsteps you hear are not a phantom's. They are the echoes of a history long buried, a truth hidden within the walls of this house. Seek the key, for it is closer than you think, waiting to reveal itself." Mrs. Carver, standing beside them, gasped softly. "My husband, he knew something, didn't he?" Her voice trembled with uncertainty, fear seeping into her words. Holmes continued to read the letter, his mind piecing together the fragments of information, each one aligning with the suspicions he had been nurturing since their arrival. The footsteps, the hidden history. This was no mere haunting. It was a call to uncover something far greater. "Your husband," Holmes said slowly, "was investigating something far more profound than mere history. He was unraveling a mystery, Mrs. Carver. A mystery tied to this very house." Mrs. Carver's face paled further, her hands clasped tightly together in front of her. "But why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he share this with me?" "Perhaps he couldn't," Holmes replied softly. "Perhaps the truth was too dangerous." Watson looked from the letter to Holmes, a look of confusion in his eyes. "What exactly is he suggesting, Holmes? A hidden treasure?" Holmes gave a slight shake of his head. "Not treasure in the way you think, Watson. A treasure of knowledge, of lost history, something that was never meant to be found. Until now." The quiet, calm assurance in Holmes's voice seemed to quiet the growing storm of fear in the room. Watson glanced at Mrs. Carver, whose eyes were now filled with a mix of disbelief and anxiety. Holmes closed the letter, folding it carefully before placing it back inside the chest. "There are more letters here. They are all connected, Watson. This is not just about footsteps. It's about uncovering something that was buried on purpose. Holmes moved swiftly across the room, his eyes scanning the piles of papers. There were maps, old, crumbling sheets that depicted the house in its early days, before time and neglect had taken their toll. They were annotated with symbols and references that seemed almost like a code. There were also journals, each one filled with writings that spanned decades, written in a hand that seemed to grow more frantic with time. The writing spoke of something hidden beneath the house, something that had been concealed for generations. One journal in particular caught Holmes's attention. Its cover was weathered, the binding cracked and fragile. Holmes opened it carefully, and as he flipped through the pages, the words seemed to leap off the page with urgency. The writer of the journal had been obsessed with a discovery beneath the house, a hidden chamber sealed away long ago. The footsteps, as it turned out, were not just a sign of a presence in the attic, but a warning that whoever had come close to uncovering the secrets of the house had vanished without a trace. Holmes's face darkened as he read aloud from the journal. The key lies beneath the floorboards of the attic. But beware, for the chamber is not just a place of knowledge. It is a prison, built to contain something that should never be set free. The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Mrs. Carver's breath caught in her throat, and Watson felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There was a depth to this mystery now, one that went far beyond footsteps and old letters. This was something ancient, something that had been hidden for a reason. Holmes closed the journal gently, his mind already racing with possibilities. The chamber, he said slowly, lies beneath the floorboards of the attic. It is clear now, Mrs. Carver, that your husband's discovery has led him to a truth too dangerous to reveal. What does it mean? Mrs. Carver asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What is this truth? Holmes turned to her, his gaze steady, but his words were laden with a warning. I don't yet know, but I intend to find out. This house, these footsteps, your husband's research, it's all connected, and whatever lies beneath the floorboards is not something we can ignore. Chapter 5. The puzzle pieces fall into place. The air in Mrs. Carver's house had grown denser with each passing hour. The quiet ticking of the clock, once a comforting reminder of the passing time, now felt like a metronome counting down to an uncertain conclusion. The attic, with its dark corners and hidden secrets, seemed to close in on them. Each step Holmes took brought him closer to an unknown truth. But the shadows of the house were alive with mystery, whispering to them in the form of those elusive footsteps that had haunted Mrs. Carver for so long. Holmes, as always, was undeterred by the unease that filled the room. His sharp eyes were fixed on the collection of documents, journals, and letters now scattered before him. His mind was working at a rapid pace, each new clue slotting into place like the pieces of a grand puzzle, slowly but surely revealing a larger picture. I believe, Holmes said softly, his voice low but filled with certainty, that we are no longer dealing with mere footsteps. The house, the letters, the journals, they all point to something far more sinister. Watson, who had been pacing nervously near the window, turned at the sound of Holmes's voice. What do you mean, Holmes? The house itself, this strange history, it's all starting to feel like something from a ghost story. Holmes, never one to be swayed by superstition or fear, fixed Watson with a penetrating gaze. It is not superstition, Watson. We are dealing with something that has been buried, hidden from the world, and it's clear now that someone, or something, has been trying to keep it that way. Mrs. Carver, who had been sitting silently in the corner, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, looked up. You mean my husband knew about this? He was uncovering something dangerous? Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, Mrs. Carver. It seems your husband's work was not simply academic. He was on the brink of discovering something profound, something hidden beneath this very house. And now, I believe that whatever it is, it's waiting to be found again. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with anticipation, but also fear. Mrs. Carver's voice trembled as she spoke again. What if it's dangerous? What if, whatever it is, it's still here? Holmes gave her a reassuring smile, though it did not fully reach his eyes. Dangerous or not, we must uncover the truth. Your husband's research is leading us to a hidden chamber, one that has been sealed for a reason. And the footsteps? They are not a haunting, but a signal. A signal that someone or something is trying to reach us. As Holmes spoke, Watson's eyes wandered back to the pile of journals. One particular journal had caught his attention. It was older than the others, its pages yellowed with age, its leather binding cracked. The ink inside was faded, but the urgency in the writing was unmistakable. As he flipped through the pages, the words began to reveal a more ominous tone. The chamber lies beneath the attic, beneath the very floorboards that have borne witness to generations. The key to opening it lies hidden, buried within the house. I have found the entrance, but the danger is greater than I realized. The knowledge contained within the chamber is not for mortal eyes. It must remain sealed, for if it is opened, no one will escape its wrath. Watson looked up from the journal, his expression grim. Holmes, this journal suggests that whatever is hidden beneath the house is more than just a treasure. It's something dangerous. Your theory about footsteps, they may be a warning after all. Holmes's gaze flickered toward the journal, but his mind was already processing the implications. Yes, Watson, a warning. The footsteps are not just echoes of the past. They are a plea, a message from those who came before us. This chamber, whatever lies within it, is something that has been sealed for a reason. And yet the message is clear. The time for secrets has passed. Mrs. Carver's voice broke through their silent contemplation. What does this mean for me, Mr. Holmes? Should I leave the house? Is it too dangerous to stay here? Holmes stood and walked toward the center of the room, his mind racing with the possibilities. The danger is not in the house itself, Mrs. Carver. The danger is what lies beneath it, but we cannot leave until we know what it is. We must open the chamber. We must see for ourselves. His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their implication. Watson, ever the more cautious of the two, felt a shiver run down his spine. Holmes, are you sure about this? What if we're playing with forces we don't understand? Holmes turned toward Watson, his face serene, his voice calm. If there is one thing I have learned, Watson, it is that ignorance is the true danger. We cannot simply ignore the truth. We must uncover it, no matter how unsettling it may be. As Holmes spoke, Mrs. Carver stood, her face pale, but determination settling in her eyes. I want to know what my husband was hiding. If he was so determined to uncover this truth, then I will too. The three of them stood in the quiet, tense room, the silence now pressing in on them like a physical force. The house seemed to exhale with them, the creaking of the floorboards and the whisper of the wind through the walls reminding them that they were not alone in this mystery. The footsteps had led them here, and now they would follow them to their end. Holmes turned back to the chest and carefully began searching through the papers once more. Among the clutter, he found something that caught his eye. A map. It was a detailed sketch of the house, with markings that indicated hidden compartments and chambers. One mark in particular was circled in red ink, the lines bold and unmistakable. Beneath it, a single word was written: entrance. Holmes stood, holding the map in his hands. His expression was unreadable. but his eyes shone with a quiet intensity. "The entrance to the chamber is beneath the floorboards. We must proceed carefully. Whatever lies beneath this house is waiting to be discovered, but we must be prepared for anything." With that, the puzzle pieces had fallen into place. The mystery was no longer about the footsteps or the strange noises in the attic. It was about the chamber hidden beneath the house, a chamber that had been sealed for a reason, and one that was about to be opened. The game, as always, was afoot. But this time, the stakes were higher, and the danger far more real. Chapter 6. A frantic chase. The night stretched on, but the calm that had once seemed comforting now felt fragile, as if the very air in Mrs. Carver's house had become charged with an unseen force. The time for quiet observation had passed, and now, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface was about to explode into action. Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Carver stood at the threshold of a truth far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. The attic, its secrets, its footsteps, its hidden chamber, was no longer just a subject of mystery. It had become a ticking clock, counting down toward an unknown revelation that had been waiting for centuries to be unearthed. Holmes, always composed, stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information they had uncovered so far. The journal entries, the maps, the letters, all had pointed to this moment. The hidden chamber, sealed away for generations, was more than just a physical space. It was a key to something far greater. And yet, despite his calm exterior, there was an urgency in the air tonight, a sharpness to Holmes's every movement. Watson stood beside him, watching his friend with a growing sense of unease. The night had taken a turn that neither of them could have anticipated. They had been prepared for mystery, for intrigue, perhaps even danger. But now, the stakes felt higher, the danger more tangible. There was something unsettling about the way the house seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if the very walls were alive with secrets waiting to be revealed. "Holmes," Watson said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his concern. "Are we really going to open the chamber? What if we're making a mistake?" Holmes's eyes flicked to Watson, his expression unreadable. "We have no choice, Watson. The truth is here, beneath our feet. It has been waiting for us to uncover it. And now that we have come so far, we cannot turn back." Mrs. Carver, standing quietly in the background, looked from one man to the other. Her face was pale, her nerves frayed, but there was a quiet determination in her eyes. "I want to know the truth, Mr. Holmes. I need to know what my husband was protecting and why he kept this secret from me." Holmes gave her a reassuring nod, though his gaze remained focused, intense. "Very well. We will uncover the truth, but we must proceed with caution. Whatever lies beneath this house is not to be taken lightly." With that, Holmes led the way up the stairs to the attic, his steps steady and measured, as if he were walking into the heart of a storm. Watson followed closely, his mind swirling with 1,000 questions, each one more pressing than the last. As they reached the attic door, Holmes turned to Mrs. Carver. "You may wish to remain outside while we investigate. This is no longer a simple matter of footsteps or old letters. There is a deep mystery here, one that may be more dangerous than we know." Mrs. Carver, though clearly anxious, nodded. "I understand. But I will not leave until I know the truth." Holmes nodded once, his lips tightening into a thin line. He placed his hand on the door and pushed it open slowly, revealing the darkened attic. The floor creaked underfoot as they stepped inside, the smell of old wood and dust thick in the air. The lantern's light flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. For a moment, there was nothing. No footsteps, no creaks, just the silence of a house holding its breath. Holmes moved quickly, his sharp eyes scanning the room. The chest in the corner, the floorboards that seemed slightly askew. Everything in the room felt out of place, as if the house itself was trying to keep its secrets hidden. And then it came. A sound, faint but unmistakable. The soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps above them. Holmes's expression never wavered. He had been expecting this. But Watson, who had been standing in the doorway, felt a shiver run down his spine. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was pacing above them in the attic, just as Mrs. Carver had described. "It's happening again," Watson whispered, his voice tight with fear. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Yes, Watson. And this time, we're going to find out who or what is making those footsteps." He moved quickly across the room, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. They had already determined that the hidden chamber lay beneath them. But now the question was, how to uncover it? Holmes crouched down and began carefully inspecting the floor, running his fingers over the seams between the boards. Watson stood beside him, watching in silence, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that they were on the verge of uncovering something profound, something that would change everything. And then, with a slight shift of his hand, Holmes found it. A loose board. The floorboard, once solid, now moved under his touch, revealing a small gap beneath it. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a quiet satisfaction. "It's here," he whispered, almost to himself. "The entrance to the hidden chamber." Before Watson could speak, a sudden noise, sharp, urgent, interrupted their thoughts, the sound of something moving quickly through the attic. Holmes stood up, his body tense, every sense alert. The footsteps above them had changed. They were no longer slow and deliberate but hurried, frantic, as if someone was trying to escape. Without warning, a figure darted past the doorway of the attic, moving so quickly that Watson barely had time to react. Holmes's instincts kicked in immediately. "Stay here," he ordered Watson, his voice low and commanding. Holmes was already moving, his footsteps silent as he raced out of the attic, following the shadow that had slipped by. Watson hesitated for a moment, his heart racing. But then, with no time to waste, he followed close behind. They chased the figure through the dimly lit halls of the house, the sounds of their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet space. The figure ahead of them was fast, darting through the shadows, its movements fluid and practiced. Holmes was gaining ground, his sharp mind calculating every move, every corner the figure might turn. But then, just as quickly as the chase had begun, it ended. The figure vanished into thin air. Holmes skidded to a stop in the hallway, his eyes scanning the darkness. But there was no sign of the intruder. The house was still, silent once more. Watson, breathless and wide-eyed, caught up to Holmes. "Where did it go?" "There's no one here." Holmes stood still for a moment, his mind racing. It was a distraction. Someone or something was trying to keep us from finding the truth. But we're close, Watson. Very close. He turned back toward the attic, his resolve stronger than ever. Whatever is hidden beneath this house, it's time we face it. Chapter 7. The Silent Truth. The chase had ended abruptly, leaving Holmes and Watson standing in the quiet hallway of Mrs. Carver's house, breathless and tense. The figure that had slipped past them in the attic was now gone, vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The silence in the house felt more profound now, almost suffocating. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the hallway, the faintest hints of shadows playing in the dim light of the lantern they had carried from the attic. "Watson," still recovering from the chase, stood beside him, his heart racing. "I don't understand, Holmes," Watson whispered, his voice tight with confusion. "Who was that? Where did they go?" It was almost as if they disappeared into thin air. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly back toward the attic, his mind working furiously. The figure, the footsteps, the hidden chamber, it was all starting to fit together, but the pieces were still elusive, like fragments of a dream just beyond reach. There was something in the air, an intangible feeling that this mystery was much deeper than they had anticipated. The house was eerily still now, the only sound being the soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath their feet. Mrs. Carver had retreated downstairs, too shaken by the events to remain in the attic. Holmes had asked her to wait, but her anxiety was palpable. The truth, once uncovered, could change everything, and that truth was still just out of reach. "We must go back to the attic," Holmes said finally, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it now. The mystery was no longer just about footsteps or hidden chambers. It had become something much darker, something that was actively trying to keep them from uncovering it. Watson followed Holmes up the stairs, his own mind racing. The tension between them was thick, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What was hidden beneath this house? And who, or what, was trying to prevent them from discovering it? When they reached the attic, Holmes immediately went to work, examining the floorboards again, tracing the loose edges that had revealed the hidden entrance to the chamber earlier. He knelt down and pushed against the boards, the same subtle pressure that had worked before. There was no sound of the hidden door opening this time. The house, it seemed, was holding its breath once again, waiting for them to make the next move. Watson watched Holmes closely, sensing that something was different now. Holmes was more focused, his usual calm replaced by a quiet urgency. He reached down to the floorboards, pushing harder this time, and with a small groan of resistance, one of the planks shifted slightly. The tension in the air tightened. "This is it," Holmes muttered, his voice barely audible. "We are very close now." Watson felt a shiver run down his spine. There was no going back now. Whatever lay beneath the floorboards would answer all the questions they had been asking. The footsteps, the figure in the hallway, the letters, the cryptic journal entries. They had all led them here, to this moment. Holmes motioned for Watson to help, and together they worked quickly, lifting the floorboard and revealing a narrow, dark passage beneath. It was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and the air that rushed out was thick with the smell of dust and something far older, more ancient. Holmes did not hesitate. He led the way, moving swiftly down the passage. Watson followed, his breath shallow, his mind racing with the possibilities. They reached a small, low-ceilinged room at the end of the passage, its walls lined with shelves and crates, some of them ancient, others more recent. The room was filled with relics, artifacts, old scrolls, and strange objects that seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. In the center of the room was a large stone pedestal, upon which sat a small, weathered box. It looked unremarkable at first glance, but as Holmes stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with understanding. This was it, the object that had been concealed for so long, hidden from the world, now revealed at last. Holmes's fingers brushed over the box's surface, and as he did, a faint sound echoed through the room. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, the sound of footsteps once again, deliberate, paced, but this time there was no mistaking it. The footsteps were coming from the shadows in the far corner of the room. Holmes turned sharply, his hand resting on the lid of the box. Watson's heart pounded in his chest as he followed his friend's gaze. his own eyes searching the darkness. The figure they had chased earlier had returned, this time standing in the far corner of the room, hidden in the shadows. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the dim light, but it was clear that this was no ghost or apparition. The footsteps had led them here. This was the person, or being, who had been trying to stop them from uncovering the truth. It was not a haunting, not a curse. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was not happy to see them. Holmes took a step forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it took a slow step forward, the faintest glint of something metallic catching the light. Holmes's hand moved toward his coat pocket, his fingers brushing against the comforting weight of his revolver. He wasn't sure what this figure wanted, but he knew one thing for certain. It wasn't here to help them. Finally, the figure spoke, its voice a low rasp like something dragged across gravel. "You should not have come here. The truth is not yours to know." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "The truth belongs to no one," he said calmly, "but it is mine to uncover, and I intend to." With that, Holmes stepped forward, his movements deliberate and purposeful. The figure in the shadows seemed to hesitate, as if deciding whether or not to move. But then, with a sudden movement, it lunged forward, its hand reaching toward the pedestal. In an instant, Holmes acted. He drew his revolver with the precision that only years of practice could provide, aiming at the figure. "Step away," Holmes said, his voice as cold as steel. "You have no claim over this knowledge." The figure stopped, its hand hovering just above the pedestal. For a long moment, neither side moved. The tension in the room was thick, like the stillness before a storm. Finally, the figure lowered its hand. "You will regret this," it said, its voice filled with an unnatural coldness. And with that, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, vanishing just as suddenly as it had appeared. Holmes stood motionless for a moment, his eyes fixed on the now empty corner of the room. Watson, still standing near the entrance to the chamber, felt a cold sweat break out along his brow. The figure had warned them. Whatever was hidden in this room, whatever was contained within that box, was dangerous, so dangerous that someone was willing to kill to keep it secret. Holmes turned back to the pedestal and carefully lifted the box. "Let's see what truth has been hidden here," he said softly, almost to himself. As Holmes opened the box, the room seemed to hold its breath. The contents, once revealed, were not what they had expected. Inside was not treasure, nor ancient scrolls of forgotten knowledge, but a small, weathered key, its metal cold to the touch and inscribed with symbols that none of them recognized. For a moment, all was silent, and then, slowly, a realization began to dawn on Holmes. This was no simple key. This was the key to the chamber beneath the house, the one that had been sealed away for so long. But what it would unlock, what they had just set into motion, remained unknown. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The atmosphere in the hidden chamber grew thicker as Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Carver stood in the dim light, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. The small, weathered key that Holmes had just uncovered lay heavy in his palm, its cold, unyielding metal a stark contrast to the warm, flickering glow of the lantern. The air seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the room itself was waiting for something, waiting for the key to turn, for the truth to be revealed. Holmes's sharp gaze never wavered as he examined the key, turning it slowly in his hand. It was unlike anything he had seen before. The symbols etched into the metal were ancient, their meaning lost to time. But Holmes had learned over the years to trust his instincts. The key was not merely a piece of forgotten history. It was a key to something far more dangerous, something that had been hidden away for a reason. Watson, standing nearby, couldn't help but feel the rising tension in the room. Every step they had taken, every piece of the puzzle they had uncovered, had led them to this moment. But the closer they got to the truth, the more it seemed that the house itself was resisting their intrusion. The footsteps, the strange figure that had appeared in the shadows, the cryptic warnings, all of it pointed to one thing. The key was meant to remain hidden, and someone, or something, had gone to great lengths to ensure it stayed that way. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice barely a whisper. "Do you think we should open it? What if it's a mistake?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to face Watson, his expression calm but intense. "Sometimes, Watson, the only way to understand a mystery is to confront it head-on. We've come this far. We must see this through to the end." Mrs. Carver, who had been standing in the background, her hands trembling as she held onto the edge of a shelf, finally spoke up. "What if it's dangerous? What if we're not meant to know this truth?" Holmes glanced at her, his eyes softening slightly. "The truth is not something that can be avoided, Mrs. Carver. Your husband sought it out, and now it is our turn to understand it." The words seemed to settle into the air, their weight heavy with the knowledge that the truth, whatever it was within reach. The house seemed to hold its breath as Holmes stepped forward, moving toward the stone pedestal where the box rested. With a steady hand, he placed the key into a small hidden lock on the pedestal, a mechanism that had been concealed in plain sight. It clicked into place with a soft, satisfying sound. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained still, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind outside, the distant echo of the world beyond the chamber. Watson held his breath, his eyes fixed on the box. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. It was as if the house was waiting for them to make the next move. And then, with a slow, almost imperceptible shift, the stone pedestal began to move. The heavy stone lid of the pedestal creaked as it lifted, revealing a dark space beneath. The air in the room seemed to change, growing colder, denser, as if the chamber itself was exhaling a long-held breath. Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Carver watched in silence as the pedestal fully opened, revealing the contents hidden inside. What they saw was not a treasure, not gold or jewels, but something far more unsettling. It was a small, delicate box, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The box was made of wood, but the carvings, deep, swirling patterns, were unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was as if the box itself had been crafted by an ancient civilization, lost to time. Holmes reached forward cautiously, his fingers brushing the surface of the box. The moment his touch made contact, a faint pulse of energy seemed to emanate from it, as though the box was alive, waiting to be awakened. Watson stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "What is it, Holmes? What's inside?" Holmes hesitated, his expression unreadable. "I don't know yet, Watson. But I have a feeling that whatever it is, it has been waiting for a very long time." He lifted the box slowly, as if afraid that too much haste might cause it to disappear back into the shadows. The room seemed to grow even quieter, the air thick with anticipation. Mrs. Carver watched, her breath caught in her throat, her hands clasped tightly together. Holmes placed the box gently on the pedestal and carefully opened it. The sound of the lid creaking echoed in the stillness, and as it swung open, a soft light, faint but unmistakable, began to glow from within. It was a pale, ethereal light, unlike any they had seen before. The room seemed to shift with the light, the walls seeming to fade and warp, as if the very fabric of reality were bending around them. Inside the box there was a small folded parchment. Holmes reached for it, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. He unfolded it carefully, the delicate paper crackling in his hands. The message written on the parchment was in an ancient script, one that neither Holmes nor Watson could decipher. But there was one word scrawled at the bottom in a hurried hand that caught their attention. Escape. For a moment all was silent. The word seemed to hang in the air, its meaning elusive but heavy with implications. Watson's eyes widened. Escape? What does it mean? Holmes's face darkened as he processed the word. I'm not sure, Watson, but I believe it's a warning. This box, this chamber, it was never meant to be opened, and whatever is contained within it is more than just knowledge. It's a force that has been locked away for a reason. Mrs. Carver's voice trembled as she spoke. What do we do now, Mr. Holmes? Should we close it again? Should we leave? Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the box. The soft glow from within flickered as if it were alive, breathing, waiting. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but filled with an unsettling certainty. No, Mrs. Carver. We cannot close it again. The truth is here and we must face it. But we must be careful. Whatever this is, whatever this force represents, it is tied to the very foundation of this house and to your husband's work. We must understand it fully before we make any decision. He closed the box carefully, the light fading as the lid clicked shut once more. The room fell back into darkness, the eerie glow vanishing as though it had never been. We have uncovered the truth, Holmes said softly, almost to himself. But the question remains. What will we do with it? Chapter 9. The Silent Truth. The house was still, but the air felt heavier than before, as if it were bracing itself for the final moment of revelation. Holmes stood, calm and composed, his fingers gently resting on the closed box in front of him. The faint light that had emanated from it moments earlier had faded, leaving the room in shadows once again. Watson, standing beside him, felt the weight of the moment, the anticipation building in his chest. The truth they had uncovered, the hidden chamber, the ancient key, and the cryptic message, all of it now led them to this one final question. What had they truly unleashed? The room was quiet, the only sound the soft creaking of the house as it settled in the stillness of the night. Mrs. Carver, standing behind them, had been eerily silent, her face pale as she looked at the closed box, her mind racing with the implications of what they had just discovered. Holmes, though his expression was calm, had a tense energy about him like a coiled spring, ready to react to whatever came next. Holmes, Watson said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the moment. We've opened it. We've uncovered the truth. But what now? What do we do with it? Holmes did not immediately respond. His gaze remained fixed on the box, his mind working through the possibilities. The word escape had been etched in the parchment inside the box, and the pale light that had flickered in the air before it vanished was not of this world. It had been a warning, or perhaps a call to action, a clue that they had yet to fully understand. For a long moment, Holmes said nothing, his mind carefully considering every angle. The silence stretched on, and the house seemed to echo with the weight of it, as though even the walls knew that the final piece of the puzzle had been uncovered. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice calm and steady, but with an undercurrent of certainty. We cannot ignore what we have found, he said softly. This house, this key, the box, everything has led us here for a reason. We are on the edge of a truth that has been hidden for centuries. And now, we must decide whether to continue down this path or close the door once more. Mrs. Carver's voice broke the quiet tension, shaky but determined. "I want to know what my husband uncovered. I have lived with this fear for so long, wondering what he was hiding from me. I need to understand it." Holmes nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "The truth may be more than you bargained for, Mrs. Carver, but it is the only way forward." Turning back to the box, Holmes gingerly lifted the lid once more. The quiet, almost soothing sound of it creaking open seemed to echo through the room, the air growing thick again with the anticipation of what lay inside. But this time, there was no flickering light, no ethereal glow. The box was simply empty. For a brief moment, the silence was broken only by the sound of their collective breath, held in uncertainty. Holmes's expression did not change. He closed the box with a calm, measured movement and stood up, his mind racing through the possibilities. Watson stepped closer, his brow furrowed in confusion. "But there's nothing inside. What does this mean?" Holmes did not look at Watson immediately, his eyes instead drifting to the floorboards beneath their feet. The room had shifted, the weight of their actions settling in like a heavy fog. The emptiness of the box was not what they had expected. If the box had been the key, the final revelation, why was it now empty? The box itself was the message, Holmes said slowly, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "Not everything is meant to be revealed in the way we expect. We've come here to uncover a truth, but what we have found is the absence of it. This absence is the key itself. It is a warning." Mrs. Carver stepped forward, her face pale with realization. "So, the box wasn't meant to contain something. It was meant to keep us from finding something?" Holmes nodded, his eyes intense with the weight of his words. "Yes, the true danger was never what was inside the box, but the truth it was meant to conceal. The key we found unlocked not a treasure, but a doorway we've opened." Watson's voice was low as he processed Holmes's words. "So we've already unleashed whatever it was we weren't supposed to find." Holmes stood still for a moment, his hand resting gently on the box. "I believe so. The message inside, escape, wasn't a clue to find something hidden. It was a final warning to those who came seeking it. We were never meant to open the box. It was the house's way of protecting itself, keeping the secrets locked away." For a moment no one spoke. The realization settled heavily over them like a dark cloud, and the quiet of the room seemed to deepen. It was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for them to understand the consequences of their actions. Mrs. Carver's voice was soft, but filled with dread. "So, what now? What happens next?" Holmes turned to face her, his gaze firm, though a trace of sadness flickered in his eyes. "We must leave this place. Whatever has been unleashed, whatever your husband uncovered, it is no longer something we can control. The truth was never meant to be known, and now that it has been, we must live with the consequences." The house, once full of hidden whispers and secrets, now felt like a tomb. The silence had grown deeper, darker, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the knowledge of what had been revealed. Holmes led the way toward the door, his steps measured, but Watson could sense the weight of the finality in his movements. They had uncovered the secret, and yet they had only revealed more questions. Mrs. Carver lingered behind, her hand resting on the pedestal where the box had once been. She was no longer the woman who had come seeking answers, but someone who had now seen the terrifying truth of what those answers had cost her. As they made their way down the stairs, out of the chamber and back into the silent halls of the house, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were leaving behind something much greater than they had ever imagined. The house, once a home filled with memories, now felt like a place of forgotten horrors, and the quiet steps of the past were still echoing in the corners of their minds. The front door of Mrs. Carver's house creaked open, and Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Carver stepped out into the cool night air. The fog had begun to lift, but the sense of unease still lingered. As they stood on the porch, Holmes turned to Mrs. Carver one last time. "You now know the truth, Mrs. Carver," Holmes said softly. "But sometimes knowing the truth comes with a cost. Be careful what you wish for." Mrs. Carver nodded, her face pale and lost in thought. She had wanted answers, but now the weight of those answers was a burden she would carry forever. As Holmes and Watson turned to leave, the house behind them stood silent, its secrets once again hidden in the darkness. Chapter 10. The final farewell. The night had fallen quiet, but the weight of the events that had unfolded in Mrs. Carver's house hung heavily in the air. The house, once a place of familial memories and hidden histories, now felt more like a tomb filled with secrets and mysteries that had been unearthed, only to reveal more questions than answers. Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Carver stood outside, the cold night air biting at their skin. But it was not the chill that made the evening feel so suffocating. It was the oppressive silence, the looming realization that the truth they had uncovered had come at a great cost. Holmes and Watson stood together on the porch, looking out into the mist that enveloped the house like a shroud. The fog swirled around them, swallowing up the world beyond. The house behind them seemed to watch with its empty windows, a silent sentinel to the mystery they had just unraveled. Mrs. Carver, though physically present, seemed distant, lost in thought. Her face, pale and drained of emotion, was the face of someone who had just come face to face with something far greater than she could have ever imagined. Her husband's research, the hidden chamber, the key, the box, everything had led them here. But what now? The answer was clear, yet it was something she had never expected. Holmes, ever the picture of composure, broke the silence, his voice low and measured. "Mrs. Carver, the truth has been revealed, but it comes with consequences. You sought answers, but the answers you received were not meant to be known. The key we uncovered, the box, the cryptic message, it was never about treasure or hidden knowledge. It was about preventing something far darker from being released." Mrs. Carver turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and a trace of sorrow. "I didn't understand, Mr. Holmes. I thought knowing the truth would bring me peace. But now it feels like I've opened a door that should have remained closed." Holmes nodded, his eyes softening. "That is the burden of truth, Mrs. Carver. Sometimes the answers we seek are more dangerous than the questions themselves." Watson, who had been standing quietly beside them, felt a knot tighten in his chest. The weight of the night's events pressed down on him. But there was one question that still lingered in his mind, unresolved. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, his voice filled with a deep unease. "What was the force we encountered in that chamber? Who or what was trying to keep us from uncovering the truth?" Holmes turned toward Watson, his face grave, his eyes reflecting the same uncertainty that had plagued him since their discovery. "I don't know, Watson. But I believe that whatever it was bound to the house itself. It was a force of protection, designed to keep the secrets hidden. And now that we have uncovered them, there may be no going back." Mrs. Carver's voice trembled as she spoke again. "Is there any way to stop it? Can we undo what we've done?" Holmes paused for a moment, his gaze distant. "I believe that the answers lie within the house itself. But Mrs. Carver, we must be cautious. Whatever was hidden here, whatever has been unlocked, cannot be easily contained. It is not just a matter of knowledge. It is something far more dangerous, something ancient, something that has been waiting for centuries to be discovered. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent. Watson could feel the weight of the history it carried, the secrets it had held for so long pressing down on him. But he also felt something else. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a sense of finality. It was as though the house itself had exhaled a long-held breath and was now at peace, having released its burden. Holmes took a slow step forward, his gaze still fixed on the house. The truth is not something to be feared, but it is something that must be respected. It has been hidden for a reason, and now that we have uncovered it, we must live with the consequences. Mrs. Carver nodded slowly, her face still pale, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. What happens now? Holmes turned back to her, his expression softening. Now, Mrs. Carver, you must decide what to do with this knowledge. The house and its secrets are yours now, but be careful how you move forward. There is a heavy price to be paid for the truth we have uncovered. A long silence stretched between them, the fog swirling around the porch like a living thing. The weight of the night, the journey they had taken, seemed to settle on their shoulders. They had come seeking answers, and they had found them. But those answers had not brought peace. Instead, they had opened a door to a darkness that was now out in the world. Holmes turned to Watson, his expression resolute. We can't stay here any longer. The house has given up its secrets, and we have done what we came to do. But now, we must move on. Watson nodded in agreement, his thoughts heavy with the implications of their discovery. They had come to the house with a singular purpose, to uncover the truth. But now, that truth was not a treasure to be claimed. It was a burden to bear, one that would follow them long after they had left the house behind. As Holmes and Watson walked down the porch steps, leaving Mrs. Carver standing in the doorway, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The air was thick with unanswered questions, and though they had uncovered the truth, it felt as though the final chapter of the mystery was still yet to be written. Holmes turned to Watson, sensing his unease. Sometimes, Watson, the mysteries we uncover are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be lived with, to shape the lives of those who find them. This house has given up its secrets, but it has not given up its power, and that is something we must all learn to live. With the two men walked away, the fog closing in around them, the house now a shadow behind them. It was no longer a place of mystery, but a place of finality. They had uncovered the truth, and now they had to leave it behind. But as they walked into the mist, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that the house, its secrets, its dangers, would follow them, always lingering in the background, like a shadow in the fog.